saws I ever saw. I never saw a saw like this saws. That's a poem that was introduced to me by a first and second grade class at Clear Spring School. And this is a video about handsaws. So these are a group of hand saws, and many of them have very special purposes, and I'll go through them and kind of explain as I go. The saw I was just using is a Japanese saw, and an interesting thing about the Japanese saw in comparison to American saws and saws from Europe are that the teeth are formed in such a way that it works when you pull. And the reason that is because the blades are made of very thin steel, and if you were to saw on the push, the blades would bend. And so that's an important feature of the Japanese saw. And the Japanese saws are very efficient. They cut very quickly. These two saws are similar. As you see, they each have a frame that holds a blade, and the blade is clamped between these 2 points. This one is made for jewelry and would be used for cutting silver or gold or other types of metal. And this is a coping saw, and it's made for cutting wood. And the advantage of this saw is that you can use it to cut different shapes by turning it as you go, because it has a thin enough blade that it can turn. Whereas the saw that I just demonstrated, the Japanese saw, has a very straight, flat blade and likes to cut straight surfaces. Now this is another Japanese saw, and you can see the teeth are very tiny, and this is one that I would use for cutting dovetails. And those very tiny teeth are very sharp. This saw also has a back on it, as you can see here. So this would be called a back saw. In some of the American saws also have backs, and so that's why it's called a back saw. So this is called a dozuki. And it makes a very fine cut and is very sharp. These blades can be replaced. They can also be sharpened if you have the right equipment and a very sharp eye to get in between those tiny little teeth with a file. This is called a keyhole saw, and it's called a keyhole saw because it has a very sharp point, and you can push it into sheetrock. And if you're building a house and you're trying to work on the electrical system in your house, and you can push that sharp thing through, and you can see the teeth on this are very large teeth. So it's not very good for just cutting on plain wood, particularly on hardwood. So let me show you. So here I have a piece of basswood, and I'm trying to cut it with this, and you can see it takes a tremendous amount of force for a little bitty saw. It will work, but it still takes, it's a lot of work. This is a very finely crafted Veritas dovetail saw, and we use some of these at Clear Spring School when the kids need to do more accurate work, because you can see the teeth are very tiny and they cut very smooth. Now this is another type of back saw that has tiny little teeth. And this is one that I got years ago when I started making musical instruments, because when you're cutting for the frets that go in to be able to form between the notes, to form the notes, you would cut in just so deep that the fret would fit in. Now this is another back saw. It's made specifically for making musical instruments, and this is one that I used when I did my book on making box guitars. And it has a little guide on here that will allow it to only go so deep for cutting your fret. So it cuts only as deep as you set it and only as deep as needed and no deeper, so you get a perfect fret line, perfect fret cut. So these are both back saws, and as you can see they have brass backs. These are both made in England. This one has very tiny teeth and this one has slightly larger teeth. But this is a cross-cut saw, so it's made for cutting across the grain. And this one would be used for cutting dovetails. And then this one, also being a cross-cut saw, is one that I use when I'm using a miter box, which I will demonstrate in just a moment. So if I want to get a good square cut on the end of a piece of wood, I can use a miter box like this, or a back saw. And that gives me a good clean cut. I'm going to make a cut with a American or English style Carpenter saw. I'm going to start by making a mark where I want to cut. It always helps to have a clear idea of where you're going to cut. This is a kind of Carpenter saw that I grew up watching my father use. And you start by putting it on the line. You always start by pulling it towards you because the teeth are cutting away. I want you to notice the change in sound as the saw comes close to finishing the cut.